Hello and welcome to Alan History Nerd. In this video I'm looking at African Americans in the North and South during the term in office of Truman, so that's 1945 to 1952. So this is for A-level history, particularly for the AQA Unit 2Q, the American Dream, Reality and Illusion 1945 to 1980, and we are looking particularly at African Americans in the North and South, the impact of the Second World War, campaigns for civil rights, the responses of the federal and state authorities. And really what we're digging down to in here is Truman and his administration's attitude towards civil rights, the growth of civil rights movements during this period, and what the state of play was in terms of segregation and discrimination in the two halves of the US. Now, obviously, all of this is enormously relevant to the world around us today, and where a number of these issues still remain unresolved. Truman is a really interesting one when it comes to civil rights and race. So Truman was from Missouri, a former slave state, and being from the South, that has particular connotations, obviously, when we're thinking about where he is likely to sit in terms of attitudes to civil rights. There is evidence that historians look at in terms of racism in his early life, possibly unsurprising given where he was raised, and there is also some sources that suggest a brief connection to the KKK, who may well have offered some support in his early career. Truman, however, had a record of voting for civil rights in the Senate in the 1930s, including voting in favor of scrapping poll taxes and action against lynching. And Roosevelt picked him as his vice president, as his running mate, partly on the basis of Truman's pro-civil rights voting record. And then there are some quite remarkable things about what happens when Truman is president. He went on to become the first president ever to address the NAACP in 1947. He spoke of his horror at the stories of black servicemen being attacked in the South and the fact that no actions were being taken against those responsible for these hideous attacks. In 1948, he issued the executive order desegregating the armed forces. In 1949, his President's Committee on Civil Rights released to secure these rights recommendation, which was an attack on discrimination against African Americans, and offered a 10-point plan to bring about change. And again, I'll look at that a bit later on in the video. In 1948, Truman gave a very strong pro-civil rights speech in Congress, calling for action on the report, which was being produced at the time. So we see in this as maybe a slightly complex picture, and perhaps quite a significant one in terms of the growth of Truman and changing of his attitudes over time. And in this, from unlikely beginnings, we can argue that Truman is actually quite a significant president in the story of civil rights, in particular with his action through executive orders and what that did in terms of desegregating the armed forces and employment in the federal bureaucracy. So we're going to look at African Americans in the North and the South. I'll start in the South. Now, in the South, African Americans faced legalized discrimination in the form of this Jim Crow laws, as they often referred to, and what this led to, which was segregation. Since the collapse of Reconstruction, which was the period following the Civil War, 65 to 77, where the essentially occupying Union forces imposed change on the South to try and end the kind of the legacy of discrimination that followed on from slavery, and Reconstruction followed the American Civil War, 61 to 65, at the end of which slavery was ended. And now the white population after Reconstruction essentially gained control of the South in a kind of backroom deal, which saw the Republicans hold the presidency and the white Democrats be left to control the South. And they used this opportunity to treat the African American population as second-class citizens. And this was reinforced by the Plessy-Ferguson Act in the Supreme Court in 1896, which set out the doctrine of separate but equal, which said essentially segregation was fine. It's the and equal bit that we'll see it fall down on when we get to Brown versus the Board of Education in '54. So there are a whole range of completely insane laws that came out of this doctrine of segregation and the Jim Crow laws. We see, for example, in North Carolina, books shall not be interchangeable between white and black, white and coloured schools. Georgia, all persons licensed in a restaurant shall serve either white people exclusively or coloured people exclusively. From Texas, separate facilities are required for white and black citizens in state parks. And the list just goes on. I mean, some of them are completely insane. There were laws segregating schools for the blind. There were laws segregating graveyards. So we can see how deep racism and discrimination ran in the South. There were also laws designed to get around the 15th Amendment. Now, the 15th Amendment ensured that everybody had the right to vote, and essentially you couldn't be stopped from voting on the basis of the colour of your skin or any form of position of servitude. But in 1940, only 3% of African Americans in the South could vote. In 47, it had risen, but it had only risen as high as 12%. And so what was being done to stop African Americans voting? Well, there was numerous methods in place. There were literacy tests and poll taxes. So the literacy tests were often very unfairly carried out by registrars who would deliberately ask impossibly hard questions to stop African Americans voting, and then ask very simple questions to allow whites to vote. The poll tax, essentially, most of the African American population in the South was very badly off, or very poor, and so they knew the poll taxes would act as a strong deterrent. So we can look at the example of Rosa Parks, who'd start off with failed to register due to failing the literacy test, where she was asked a ridiculously hard question, and then when she did get to vote, she had to pay what, based on her wages at the time, would have been a very high poll tax. But again, showing her determination to carry out her democratic right. Now, part of the thing, and again, one of the other reasons why the literacy test was such a barrier was that the black schools in the South were very poorly funded, and the access to kind of higher education and things was largely blocked. We see George McClellan, who managed to get a place at Oklahoma State University, but only after a Supreme Court case. But he was forced to sit on a desk by himself outside the classroom. He was forced to sit at a table by himself in the canteen, and so we see this continuation of segregation and discrimination. The legal system and police were institutionally racist. A threat of violence was a constant for the African American community. There had been many lynchings in the 1920s and 1930s, creating a belief that anyone standing against segregation could face violent retribution. And essentially, what was shown, there was no protection of legal recourse on this. That the courts, the judicial systems, the judges, the juries were all set up in favour of the white racists who were carrying out the attacks, and therefore prosecutions just didn't happen. Sadly, the KKK would flourish again in its third coming in the 1950s as racial tensions rose. The fact that most African Americans in the South were dependent on the white population for work or use of land, so a lot of the African American population were sharecroppers working in kind of in agriculture, or were in menial low-paid jobs working for white employers, and so this again acted as a method of control over the African American population, because people who stood out of line lost their jobs, and if they lost their jobs, they lost the ability to support themselves and their families. Within the African American community, church leaders were probably the most respected and most important group, and this is a group that we'll see coming to the front with later civil rights movements, and notably Martin Luther King. So in the North, things were different. Legal segregation did not exist, but there was what we often refer to as de facto segregation, especially in housing. So this is when it's not the law. There isn't a law saying that you had to live in separate areas and go to separate schools and things like that. But what there was de facto segregation. So what happened is the black population would end up in an area, the white population would leave, and therefore you would have these African American, what we refer to as ghettos, and the process known as ghettoization taking place. And so you ended up with these African American areas, such as Harlem in New York, and the population therefore was segregated, but it wasn't segregated by law. Whilst many African Americans in the North were very poor, there were some better opportunities in the North, and some better paid jobs, notably in the motor industry in Detroit. There was growing success of black sportsmen and artists. For example, we've got Jackie Robinson, who was the first black man to play Major League Baseball in '47 and was MVP by '49. Joe Louis was boxing heavyweight champion for 12 years, up to '49. Louis Armstrong, a very famous jazz musician, and we've got Billie Holiday, a really important and famous singer. Again, linking into civil rights, if you check out her song "Strange Fruit." Now, this showed there were again success stories in the North, and this success continued into politics as well. In '45, there were two black congressmen in the House, William Dawson representing the 1st District of Illinois in Chicago, and Clayton Powell representing Harlem in New York. Again, with the way the American political system works, ghettoization in a way could play into this, because if you've got large concentrations of population, then essentially large concentrations of population become congressional districts. Congressional districts lead to representation. So this was an important step forward. There were significant issues in the North, notably discrimination in the legal justice system, in which black people tended to be given much harsher sentences, were treated differently by the police, who were far more willing to use violence against the black population. In this, maybe we need to remind ourselves that we're talking about 1945 to '52, because sadly, some of these statements making out you could potentially see connections to the modern day. The Great Migration started around 1900 and saw millions of African Americans leave the South and move north. And this links to some of the stuff that I was talking about just a little bit earlier with the ghettoization and the growth of the black population in some of the North cities. In the 1940s, about 1.4 million African Americans migrated, with a further 1.1 million in the 1950s. Now, this causes significant shift in the South, but it also causes a significant change in the North, and some of this is positive and some of this is negative, where we see some increased racial tension in the North, but also we see new movements which can push towards feeding the civil rights movement starting to develop. So, for example, in some of the northern ghettos, we saw movements such as the Nation of Islam, which was established in the '30s, growing, calling for black empowerment and greater black independence. So the North was shifting and changing, and with this move in population and the fact that there wasn't the legalized segregation, there wasn't restriction on voting, as I mentioned earlier, we started to see some black representation in Congress. Now, a really important part of this story is the impact of the Second World War. Now, during the Second World War, black servicemen had served in segregated units, and early on, the African American soldiers were limited in the roles that they did, and were held back, for example, from becoming frontline troops because of various parts of kind of racial prejudice against them. But this started to change during the war. By the end of 1944, over 700,000 black soldiers in the army, and the non-combat policy ended. So you started to see black soldiers playing a very active role in the front line. There were 165,000 black Americans in the Navy, and restrictions on only being officer stewards was lifted. African Americans no longer were excluded from the Marine Corps, and we saw 17,000 African Americans in the Marine Corps by the end of the war, and the Coast Guard, and we saw 5,000 black servicemen in the Coast Guard. There were some really significant black units playing a really important role in the Second World War. The 761st Tank Battalion fought very notably at the Battle of the Bulge. At the time, 2,500 African Americans behind the front line volunteered to fight alongside the white soldiers, and did so during these key battles, but were later returned to their segregated units. The 371st Tank Battalion is hugely significant in the story of the Second World War, as they liberated Dachau and Buchenwald concentration camps. And so here we see this connection between civil rights in America and the horrors of the Second World War and the Holocaust. So the role African Americans played in the Second World War was really significant, and that started to change attitudes at home to a degree. And it also started to change the perspective of a lot of the African Americans, particularly the black soldiers who, for the first time, were seeing the world outside the southern states. And this started to demonstrate to them how things could be different. In Europe, they were warmly welcomed as liberators, and were also in an unusual position of being relatively well off, because they were being reasonably well paid, and the horrendous situation that there was in Europe. And so they were being welcomed as liberators in the same way that white American soldiers were being welcomed as liberators. In Britain, when fights broke out between black and white US servicemen, who were again still being kept in segregated way, the locals frequently stepped in on the black soldiers' side. Churchill spoke out against segregation. And so again, we're seeing seeing a different perspective. And the war sped up the Great Migration with the demands for workers in northern factories. Tensions did, however, remain and grow in some of these new areas. So, for example, we see a race riot in Detroit in '43 that involved 100,000 people and led to 34 deaths. And we also see the horrendous treatment of some of the returning black servicemen in the South, many of whom faced violence and even death. Some of this treatment was absolutely truly disgusting, and something that absolutely horrified Truman, and some of the important sources at this time of him writing to other people in the army, explaining his absolute disgust of what's going on, and in particular the failure of Southern administrations to do anything about what was going on. A couple of key figures it's worth looking at are William Hastie and A. Philip Randolph. So William Hastie was a black federal judge who was appointed civilian aide to the Secretary of War, Cordell Hull. Hastie used his position to fight segregation and agitate for equal opportunities for black servicemen. So he's a really important figure. We've also got A. Philip Randolph, who led the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. So he was a really, really important trade unionist, was A. Philip Randolph, as well as a civil rights campaigner. So he campaigned for better pay and conditions for his members. He also founded the magazine The Messenger, which championed civil rights and other issues to do with equality. And Randolph, again, is one of the early, really significant civil rights movement leaders, and had an influence on Roosevelt's decision to create the Fair Employment Practices Committee, or FEPEC, in 1941. So we've got, again, a couple of key figures there who are making a significant difference. The war during the war, there was the Double V campaign. Black Americans were really worried about the rise of fascism in Europe, and Double Victory hinged on the idea that defeating fascism in Europe could be linked to defeating discrimination and oppression at home. It was begun by the editors of the Courier newspaper from Pittsburgh in '42, and the campaign was later headed by A. Philip Randolph. Randolph threatened to lead a march of 50,000 African Americans on Washington to end discrimination in government and defense industries, and this had led in '41 to Roosevelt signing Executive Order 8802, and this was the first presidential directive on race since Reconstruction. It aimed to prohibit discrimination in war industries. It lacked enforcement powers, but it was a symbolic shift, and this is something that we'll see continued by Truman, and so therefore is an important staging post and shows the impact that the war had on civil rights. So following the war, we see this continuation of the campaigns for civil rights, and there are a couple of really important groups in this. There's the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, and they ran their journey of reconciliation in April 47, where 8 black men and 8 white men took a 2-week bus ride through Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Kentucky. The men were testing the 1946 Supreme Court judgment Morgan versus Virginia that ruled against segregation on interstate transport. The test in a way failed because they were arrested and jailed repeatedly on their journey and faced horrendous harassment. But this did gather huge media coverage, which was really significant methodology and important way of progressing civil rights. The National Association for the Advancement of Coloured People, the NAACP, used a variety of tactics to push civil rights, but probably their most successful was the use of their Legal Defence Fund to chip away at Plessy Ferguson. And we see this with Smith versus Allwright in 44, which now meant African Americans could vote in Texan primaries, which they'd been previously banned from. Morgan versus Virginia in 46. Which again is mentioned above, which it brought an end to segregation in interstate buses, at least in theory. Shelley versus Cramer meant that estate agents couldn't refuse to show a house to potential buyers just because of their race. And then we see McLaurin versus Oklahoma State. We saw McLaurin sat outside the classroom earlier, and Sweet versus Painter, both in 1950. And these were about entry into previously all-white universities. So McLaurin versus Oklahoma State was so he had access to do his PhD, and Sweet versus Painter was in Texas, and that was to do with the fact that the law schools were there wasn't an equivalent for potential black law students. And so we start to see a chipping away, and this chipping away will eventually lead to Brown versus Board of Education in 54. There were also local campaigns in the South, notably on increasing the black votes, notably in Georgia in 46, so there was very notable pushback against that following that, and in Mississippi in 47. So looking more at the federal response, well, we've got Truman establishing his President's Committee on Civil Rights in 46, aiming to make sure the Bill of Rights was a reality for African Americans. This committee repeats its report that I mentioned earlier to secure these rights in 49, which Truman urged Congress to support. These recommendations including anti-lynching laws, abolition of poll tax, voting rights laws, permanent EPC, the anti-discrimination in interstate travel, anti-discrimination in the armed forces, a civil rights division for the Justice Department, a ministry of support for civil rights suits, establishing a United States Commission on Civil Rights. Sadly, Congress did not share Truman's vision. So here we can see Truman really pushing to further civil rights, but Congress acting as it often does as a bloc. There was particular opposition amongst the strongly racist elements of the Democrat Party, such as James O. Eastland in Mississippi and Strom Thurmond in South Carolina, who held things up in the Senate, while state governors such as Wright in Mississippi and Talmadge in Georgia also fought to maintain segregation and discrimination. There was some progress. By 52, only 5 states retained the poll tax. So we were starting to see some movement, and obviously we're going to see some movement also through Truman's executive orders. So, for example, in 48, he ended discrimination and segregation in the armed forces and guaranteed fair employment in the federal bureaucracy. There was resistance to this in the armed forces and within the federal bureaucracy, but this was an important step forward. We see Executive Order number 10308, which established the Committee on Government Contract Compliance, This aimed to ensure only companies who complied with the ending of discrimination received federal contracts. So this is using the kind of federal dollar to try and improve civil rights. The backdrop to all this is the Cold War. And as states in Africa gained their independence and during decolonization, the segregation of the races and racial discrimination in the US damaged the US standing in the UN and would potentially help Soviet influence, as the Soviet Union in looking to try and gain the support of or connect with these different countries as they were emerging, could point to the racism in the US and say, look, you don't want to be with them. They aren't on your side. We are. And so in this, we see a backdrop that may well have played an important part in Truman's motivation. And the motivation of Truman is highly debated. So is it that Truman, despite his upbringing, sees the unfairness in racial discrimination and is truly trying to fight to end it? Does he see the huge potential in terms of votes if he can harness the African American vote, and therefore he's acting in the way that he does? Is it he's concerned about the United States international standing, and therefore he's acting on that? Now, the most likely answer to that is a combination of all three. And I think it's important not to underestimate Truman's impact in terms of laying some of the groundwork for the later action of presidents when it comes to civil rights. And we also are seeing movement at this point through the Supreme Court, which is going to build up to Brown versus Board of Education and then other kind of actions on civil rights, which we'll see in the Warren Court later. So thank you very much for watching. I hope that's proved helpful on what is a kind of difficult but really interesting topic. Again, I will be adding more videos to this playlist looking at US politics between 1945 and 1980. There is also lots of playlists on the channel looking at other parts of US and European history, as well as sections on UK and US politics. So lots of stuff to help you with your studies, or if you're just interested in finding out more about these things. Thank you very much for watching. If you liked the video, please hit like. If you have any comments, please leave them below. And if you're interested in what our channel does, then please do subscribe. Thank you very much for watching.